Is it working?
Yeah, good.
Okay. All right. So the first question you have has to do with any experience that I've had with the drug cartels. And the experience that I've had, I've traveled in several different countries throughout Central America and also in Mexico. I'll be in Colombia actually in about a month. So in a month, I'd be much more. But the organization that I work with, I'm a director, a member of the board of Witness for Peace, and they have been working in Mexico and Central America, South America for the last 25 years, and so a lot of their work touches on the drug war and the effects of drug cartels in that part of the world, and so that's where I get most of my experience from. I was in Oaxaca, which is in the southwestern part of Mexico, just this last January, where we met with a lot of different people, including people that worked reporters who did a lot of work covering the war on drugs as it's affecting Mexico. And your second question has to do with why the drug cartels are so powerful. And there's one reason, right off the bat is money. I mean, you're talking about significant amounts of money. I mean, like more money than countries have kinds of money. And when you have those kind of resources, then it's just simply, there's little impediment to your will. How about that? But it's more than just money. And this is something that I think is really, really important for us to try and remember, at least acknowledge, when we're talking about a lot of the developing economies and the economic structure and the relationship between the state and the drug cartels. There is not the kind of clean break between the drug cartels and the military and the drug cartels and the state in Mexico that there is in the United States. On one hand, I don't want to act like that break is incredibly clean in the United States either. We have plenty of instances in which, and not just kind of conspiracy theory hokey stuff, right? I'm talking about documented cases where the United States security forces have been involved with drug cartels. Planes flying back from Nicaragua and Honduras in the 1980s, loaded with cocaine, and then coming back with guns to support the Contras, for example. The fact of the matter is that drugs are a way to make tremendous amounts of money, and so they're used by lots of different groups. If you are a political group and you are kind of on the outside and on the margins, and you need funding and resources to carry on legitimate political work, by which I mean like elections and campaigns, well, the temptation to get involved in the drug business is incredible. If you're a less than legal group, right? If you are more of a paramilitary or revolutionary group, well, then the incentive to get involved with drugs as a way to foment and maintain your group's presence, to arm your group, is incredible. And that kind of creates this condition where you have, revolving doors in which they're not just, it's very, very difficult to separate drug cartels from political groups, from reactionary paramilitary groups that are working on behalf of the state in a non-extra legal way, is what they call it, and revolutionary radical groups trying to support themselves. They just simply don't have this kind of neat breaks between them. It's much more muddled than that. But it also creates this idea of a revolving door in which you have people who are fighting on one side, both sides really, who have gotten their weapons, their arms, their training in military tactics, either through the government, for example, the Mexican military, or from the United States government as part of anti-drug campaigns. So it's a very, very dangerous situation in which they have the best arms, the best training, and copious amounts of money. That's why they're so powerful. They're incredibly difficult to get out. The third argument you have here, or question rather you have, is how the drug cartels have affected people in America and Mexico. And I don't want to downplay the effect that drugs have had on the United States. Drugs are a devastating plague on the United States. In particular, the highly addictive, corrosive drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, I mean, these things are just incredibly bad news, all right? And gang fighting leads to huge amounts of violence in the United States, much of it fueled by money from the drug war. But the impact on the people of Mexico in particular has been absolutely devastating. I think the last statistic that I read, I think it goes back to 2002 or maybe 2003. But we're talking about 71,000 people killed. 71,000 people killed. Dozens of mayors, dozens of city councilmen, dozens of reporters, right? Can you imagine what would happen in the United States today if 20 mayors were killed over the course of the next year to 6 months? Like what that would do. And it has an effect. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to be, nobody clean, nobody who's interested in justice, nobody who's interested in fair play and the rule of law and democratic politics wants to run for city office or for state held office or to be a judge in these parts of Mexico. That's like suicide, right? They have an expression down there: take our lead or take our silver, right? Okay, you can either get paid by a drug cartel and do what they want, or they can kill you, right? And I mean, really, that's not a hard choice, right? I mean, that's what you have, is you have a situation in which the state has become, in many parts of Mexico, just literally ungovernable. That goes back to what I was saying previously about how there isn't this sort of neat break between the drug cartels and the military, between the drug cartels and political parties. When we finally, root out the corruption and kick one party out of power, a lot of the military that supported that particular party just becomes a paramilitary organization. That is to say, they keep their guns, keep their ammunition, take their equipment, including helicopters and tanks and armored personnel vehicles, and they just kind of, they still wear the green and the camo. They're just now fighting on behalf of a drug cartel instead of fighting on behalf of the state. The people who move into the military ranks were the people from the drug cartel before. I mean, it's not quite, I'm oversimplifying the revolving door nature of it to make it clear, but it is simply not that idea that if we oust one political party and replace them with another, that we haven't just traded, one drug cartel for another being in the head of power. And I mean, that's the real effect. What's at stake in Mexico are what are called las plazas, the plazas, right? And you're dealing with drugs and you're dealing with violence. You're really dealing with a territorial issue, okay? So when you're talking about drugs, there's three different territories that matter, right? There's the place where the drugs are grown, okay? If you control the place where the drugs are grown, well, that's good, right? You have the primary access to supply. But you also need to go to the place where the drugs are consumed. That's the place of demand. Okay? There's simply not enough people in Mexico who have the kind of money to spend on heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, etc., to make it worthwhile to sell the product there. That's a product that is made for export, right? So you've got to get the drugs from the places they're produced, southern Mexico, Colombia, etc., and get them to the markets, which we're talking about the United States, but also Western Europe. But in our case, we're going to just talk about the United States. All right. The third territory, which is crucial, are las plazas, right? The plazas. Those are the routes. The routes to get the drugs from point of production to point of sale. That's what they're fighting over, right? There's so much drugs being grown in Colombia, Peru, South America, being produced in southern Mexico. So many drugs are being produced in that part of the world that, and then the consumption, the demand for drugs in the United States is virtually limitless, okay? That will consume all the drugs that you send our way, all right? So now what matters is getting them from point A to point B. That's the toughest thing. I mean, think about it like, a bandwidth on your computer, right? And you're trying to download a movie at home and your sister's trying to download, everything that Katy Perry's ever done, right? Well, your system doesn't have enough bandwidth to handle both of those downloads at once, right? So what do? You go in your sister's room and you unplug her computer so that she can't download stuff anymore, right? And then she comes in and, throws your iPhone on the floor and breaks it. Well, now imagine that only one of you is known as Las Zetas and the other one of you is known as the Mexican government. And you have a really good idea, and you're both armed with the latest in military technology. And you now have a good idea of what's happening in Mexico. It's about control of Las Plazas, the bandwidth, the routes between point A and point B. And that's where the violence comes in. So your fourth question, and I'm going to go with question 4 and question 5 at the same time, which is how does the drug war contribute to the drug cartels, and how are American citizens fueling the drug war? Because I think those two things have a lot in common. The most important thing to remember is how we deal with drugs is monumentally messed up. I mean, monumentally messed up, okay? We can argue, I think, reasonably whether or not there's such a thing as reasonable use of an addictive drug. There's certainly some addictive drugs which our country takes as being perfectly reasonable to use, right? Alcohol is an incredibly addictive drug. Tobacco is an incredibly addictive drug. Nicotine is an incredibly addictive drug. Caffeine, that's the one I was reaching for. These are all incredibly addictive drugs, right? But they're the good drugs, right? Okay, we also have legal drugs, right, like Oxycontin and Vicodin and Percocet, and drugs that are produced legally for legitimate kinds of uses. Now, here's the one thing that I think is just absolutely fascinating, right? The company that, let's say, makes Oxycontin, right? Now, do you think they don't know? I mean, do you think they just genuinely don't know how much of their product is being used illegally? In fact, they're banking on significant amounts of that product being used illegally, right? If 10%, just 10% of the Oxycontin that goes out on the market, right, is used in an illegal way, and the number suggested is much, much higher than that. Do you know of any company that would be willing to give up 10% of its overall sales? Okay, when the people who own Oxycontin, begin to make their product, they sit down at the beginning of the fiscal year and they're like going to project how much profit they're going to make. They're assuming significant amounts of illegal use of their product into it, right? Okay, so this whole idea of how drug cartels work, I think, is really, really interesting. And so we have this double standard, right? And you can watch it in particular with opioids like Oxycontin. When we cut back and restrict the availability of Oxycontin, the price goes up. This is simple supply and demand economics, right? The less Oxycontin there is available on the streets, the higher the price of Oxycontin goes. But what's interesting is there's a tipping point, right? There's a point at which the person who really, really wants Oxycontin will pay, and then they'll stop paying, and they'll go for the much cheaper and significantly more dangerous heroin to get the same kind of high, right? We saw that in Massachusetts about 5-10 years ago when they really cracked down on prescription painkillers. What we saw is not that people stopped using drugs. What we saw is that they stopped using Oxycontin and started using heroin, right? That's because we continually try to treat this as though it is a crime problem. And we need to start treating it as though it is a health care problem. All right? If you are out, listen, I'm not here to judge anyone's recreational behavior, all right? But if you need to take an Oxy before you go to school, you have a drug problem, all right? If you need to knock back 3-4 drinks every day when you get off work, you have an alcohol problem, all right? That is a significant amount of alcohol you're taking in, all right? If you need to wake up in the middle of the night and smoke a cigarette, you have a nicotine problem. If you don't have a Mountain Dew in the morning and you get a headache, you have a caffeine addiction. These are health care issues, right? And the consequences of those behaviors are health care consequences. Let me give you an example, right? Minnesota is doing a really great thing here. I don't know what the status is, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to pass a law that makes it so that if you are with somebody who overdoses on heroin and you call an ambulance or call the police, you won't go to jail, right? Now, the fact is that you would be sitting in a position where you're going to risk one of your friends dying because You don't want to go to jail for distributing the heroin to him. And I mean, come on, we have this case just down here in Mankato, right, where a kid sells a drug, somebody takes it and dies, and now that kid's on trial for third-degree murder, right? Okay. Are you going to call the cops? Are you going to be the one who's like, are you going to risk it? That's silly. If we start treating it not like a crime, but like a healthcare problem, we get people, first of all, into hospitals when they're ODing faster, okay? We get them treatment quicker, all right? We know this is true, okay? We also get people into treatment centers rather than jails, all right? In 1970, when the war on drugs began, we had 300,000 people in the penal system in the United States. We now have 2.5 million people in the penal system in the United States. Okay? In Louisiana, 1 in 7 people of color is somehow either in a prison, on parole, or on probation. That's insane, right? And it's because, quite frankly, we criminalize the drugs that poor people are interested in and turn a blind eye to the drugs that rich people are interested in. Can you imagine a DEA drug raid like in North Mankato? St. Peter, right? Busting in the doors of housewives taking Percocet. Right? Can you imagine that happening? You imagine them coming in their SWAT team gear with the battering rams and crashing in the door and grabbing in somebody's mom who's sitting there stoned out of her mind on 4 or 5 different Oxycontin? Can you imagine that? So don't tell me that there's nothing that has to do with poverty, right? This is a real serious problem, and we continue to treat it like a crime problem. We continue to treat it like it's a poverty problem, like this is what poor people are doing. It's absolutely ridiculous. Here are the facts. Overwhelmingly, Americans support the legalization of marijuana. It's well over 50%, right? But let's go back a second, okay? We'll go back to that. I was explaining about the growth of drugs, growing them, the pipeline, and selling them in the United States. Nobody in this country is not using drugs because they can't find them. Okay? I guarantee you that almost any kid in this high school right now can go out and score a dime bag of marijuana within a couple hours. Right? You know, there's probably a few of them who are really super oblivious. But I mean, even the most oblivious of you at least know who the kid who's smoking pot is and who to go to, right? Drug use hasn't gone down. We've been fighting a war on drugs since before I was born. I'm 42 years old. We've been fighting the war on drugs since before I was born. Have we seen any net decrease in drug use? Any problems with availability? Nope. There's not one of you that can't go out. And that's just simply a drug like marijuana, right? Try hard enough, you'll be able to find meth, no problem. Even in places like rural Minnesota where we're sitting, heroin is readily available. There's no problem finding heroin. So why are we fighting a war on drugs? What is the reason for it? Well, there's 2 possible answers. Here's possible answer number 1. Possible answer number 1 is that we're insane. As a society, we are genuinely insane. What do you call a person who keeps doing the same thing over and over and over again and expects a different result? That is by definition insane, right? Okay, if that door were locked and you didn't have the key and you got up and tried it once, okay, that's reasonable. You get up and try it twice, so I'm like, well, he's probably frustrated. But if he tries to keep, gets up every